Hey everyone, welcome back to Brain Buzz. On today's episode, we had the pleasure of speaking with Tessa Charlesworth. Tessa is a doctoral student in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, where she studies implicit bias.
In today's episode, she defines what implicit biases and explicit biases are, how we can change our implicit biases as individuals. She also talks about how our exposure to different groups can change the way that we think and how implicit biases have actually developed and changed over time. Enjoy the episode.
Friends, colleagues, and socially biased individuals, welcome back to another episode of Brain Buzz. We're your hosts. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Drake.
And today we are joined by a member of the Mazarine Banaji Lab, doctoral candidate in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, Tessa Charlesworth. Tessa, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us, taking the time out of your very busy schedule. We learned just before we started recording that today was a particularly meaningful day for you for many reasons. Do you want to just quickly share that, or is that a secret that we should keep?
No secret. I was texting some of my friends, so some people already know.
The word is out.
The word is out, yes. So today I am submitting my dissertation to my committee. Yay! And what that also means is I wrote what I've found to be probably the hardest piece of writing that I've ever done, which is the acknowledgement section of my dissertation. And it was hard because it was emotional, but I also wanted to sound sophisticated and professional while also cracking some inside jokes and everything. So it took me like 3 hours to get 2 pages out, but I'm happy with it.
I mean, that's a good rate. I'd be thrilled if I was writing. I'd be absolutely overwhelmed if I was writing at that pace. So congratulations. Again, you kind of having that knowledge like, hey, you just finished this huge milestone and you've taken the time to come and chat with us is obviously really meaningful to us. So thank you for doing it.
Of course.
Can you lead us in and explain? We've had a couple episodes on biases before, but talk to us about what implicit biases are and what work you're doing in that area.
Yeah, definitely. So implicit bias has sort of become a big buzzword, both in the field of psychology and social psychology, but also in the broader sort of zeitgeist of our world. And the way I like to think about it is in contrast to our explicit biases. So we all sort of have an intuition of what our explicit biases are. These are things that we're able to consciously report, we can introspect on. So we basically can look into our minds and say, how biased am I against, people who speak with an accent, or people who are overweight, or people who have a mobility aid, or something like that. Those are our explicit biases. If I were to go around with sort of a clipboard and ask you what you thought about those people, you would tell me. The problem is that's not the entire part of what we think about and feel about social groups and other people. We also have these more sort of automatic or sort of gut feelings that come up when we encounter someone who's different from us on some dimension. And these more automatic feelings are our implicit attitudes or our implicit stereotypes. And they're implicit because that sort of implicit idea means that they're latent or they're sort of hidden in our mind in some way. So we might not be aware of holding them. We might not be able to introspect and find those attitudes in our mind. Or even if we are aware of them, we might not be willing to report on them. So this is often sort of where implicit bias is more commonly used in popular culture. It's this idea that, deep down you may know that you're racist, but you just don't want to tell anyone. And that's another sort of part of implicit bias is both the unawareness, but also the unwillingness to report your biases. Right. So what we do to sort of get around those things is we measure your attitudes indirectly. So traditionally, we've measured them using something called the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT, which has a buzzword in and of itself now in the popular culture. And this is basically like a speeded task that you'll do on the computer, where you'll pair pictures with words, and we basically are able to see how closely you associate group concepts like Black or white people with other kinds of concepts. So good versus bad, or maybe smart versus dumb, or strong versus weak, and so on and so forth. And by just using speed for you to categorize these concepts together, we're able to get more of an indirect assessment that doesn't require you to explicitly report what you're thinking or feeling.
Right. So you're looking at more or less reaction time to use these descriptive words, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And presumably, if you are responding quicker, that means that you're implicitly more biased to that that direction. If it takes longer, then you're more enacting some explicit bias to kind of answer that. Is that kind of
that's a good way of thinking about it. Is like sort of the faster you associate two concepts in mind, the more they're associated in your mind, right? So if you're really fast to associate insects and bad things and flowers and good things, they're probably implicitly associated in your mind. Whereas if you're probably a lot slower to associate insects and good things, it's even hard for me to say, and flowers and bad things. So those are kind of the ways we're just using reaction time to see these kinds of conceptual associations in your mind.
Right. So you're not a fan of bugs. That's clear.
I'm not a fan of bugs. No, I've been trying to watch nature documentaries because I know they're important to our ecosystem, and I'm trying to develop sympathy. But just like spiders are very, very many legs and very many eyes. And
you prefer 2 or 4. I get it. Tessa, this work, I'm not super familiar with it, but I know it's really important in social psychology. It reminds me of like a study on children and looking at these implicit biases. How early do these implicit biases start to kick in? Like, when can we start seeing these in humans?
It's such a great question. I think we still don't know quite how early these kinds of representations emerge in our mind, but we can already start to see cues of them in infancy. So sort of cues of associating good things with people who look like us or people who talk like us actually emerge as newborns. So there's a really amazing study that looks at language-based biases. So, I prefer people who speak English or French, being bilingual. I'm also from Canada, so I was, trained in the French immersion system. So I prefer people who speak those languages, whereas, someone from, I don't know, somewhere in Germany would have a German preference, and so on and so forth. What's shocking is that newborns, babies, are listening to these languages in the womb, right? Like, we're talking to kids or babies in their womb all around. And so when they come out, they already have a kind of preference. They prefer to listen to speakers of their native language than speakers of foreign languages. And that kind of early preference is some of the roots of those biases that we might see later on things like the IAT, for instance.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
This has never been tested. I guarantee it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pose a hypothetical scenario here. I'm thinking of like a mother traveling. I know this is kind of crazy to think now in this world that we're living in. It's been a while since people have been able to travel, but I'm thinking like imagine a mother that has a newborn, is carrying a newborn, or carrying not a newborn, is pregnant, a pregnant woman, is traveling to say she's an English speaker and she goes to Korea. And she's surrounded by the Korean language.
Yeah.
Would the baby, when the baby comes out, would it have that implicit bias towards that language as well? I'm curious.
That's a great question. I think
it'd be really hard to test.
it'd be pretty. You'd have a pretty small sample size, I'm sure. The person who does this amazing work is Katie Kinsler, and she has some really interesting studies looking at to what extent the diversity of exposure really does matter. So I'm not sure about sort of in the womb, like your question would pose, but we know that children who early on are exposed to a diversity of languages, so like people who are raised in French immersion schools or like are bilingual in some way, they have less bias just overall because they have from an early age sort of thought, okay, it's not just English speakers around me. There seem to be these other kinds of languages and these other kinds of people. And so when I hear another language, I'm less likely to just sort of discount it or turn away from it. Right. So I do think that, it would be a really cool study to run with sort of traveling moms and see what's going on. But I certainly, once they're children and walking around in the world and being exposed to their culture, exposure really matters. Like the diversity of exposure really does leave an imprint on the mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that line of work is always kind of spurred by, moms watching different languages, even though they don't speak it, right? While they're pregnant, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to put on French, even though I don't speak French, just so my baby can hear it, right? Like, that makes sense to me. And that kind of, not necessarily a myth. I guess it is kind of
Mhm.
based in, you know, some logic there, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, your work isn't specifically on children though, so let's kind of get into what you are looking at within implicit biases, and
Mhm.
you've looked at how it can change over time. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. And some of that is actually looking at kids. So change shows up in many different ways, right? We can change as individual people. I can provide a particularly persuasive argument and change your mind about, I don't know, facts about bugs or something like that. Um, we can also change as a culture. So over just the span of history and sort of the gradual unfolding of our society, we can change. But we can also change across development. So kids don't come out of the womb except in the case of language, they don't come out in the womb preferring a certain race or preferring a certain gender. It's really like over their lifespan that they learn these biases from their culture. So those are all three different ways that we can change, and three different ways that we can change our implicit biases. And my work is actually trying to look at all three in different papers. But certainly the majority of my work has focused on this second type of change that I mentioned, which is the societal change. So over the course of history, how have our implicit biases changed?
How do you get at that when obviously you can't go back and ask, somebody from the Victorian era? Well,
Mm.
unless they're really old, I suppose. But the
A
world's oldest.
300-year-old subject.
Yeah, yeah, it's very unlikely. But
Yeah.
how do you actually go back and analyze or extract data to help you answer those kinds of questions?
So I love that you asked that question, because a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, I would have had a simple answer, which is we use archival data of surveys or IATs that people collected, and then we sort of just track the results over time. I'm going to talk about that first, but I'm super excited to also talk about a new method that we're developing, and others have been developing as well, that we actually could go back to the Victorian era and start to uncover some of the biases that were embedded in that culture as well and quantify them over time. So
Ooh,
it's not entirely unheard of that we might be able to get that, like, quote unquote 300-year-old participant in our study.
fantastic.
So first way we've done it, and sort of the most intuitive way, is by looking at these archival data sets. So what that means is back in 2000, basically, my advisor, Mazreen Banaji, her advisor, Tony Greenwald, and their student, Brian Nosek, decided that they should put up this test, the IAT, online somewhere into some sort of online repository. And this was pretty prescient, because it was still when, like, the internet was very clunky and people called it the World Wide Web and things like that. So they put these IATs up online sort of in the early 2000s. And since then, we've been collecting data on people's implicit attitudes towards multiple social groups. So biases about body weight, about disability, about race, about sexual orientation, and so on. And what we've done in some of our first papers is to really make use of that expansive data set, and using different kinds of techniques. We've cleaned the data, we've prepared the data in a way that we can control for how people are changing, like sample changes over time and all those things. And then we can trace the trajectories of attitudes at a really, like, fine-grained temporal scale from the 2000s all the way through to now. So
Cool.
that's like method one.
Right.
And what we found there, just to give like the highest level overview, is we looked first at 6 different attitudes. We looked at attitudes about many of the ones that I already mentioned. So body weight, disability, age, skin tone, sexual orientation, and race. And what we found is, contrary to this previous notion that, like, implicit biases are these habits, they're really deep down hidden inside our mind, so they just can't be changed. Contrary to that idea, we actually found that over the long term, implicit attitudes about race, sexual orientation, and skin tone have all decreased towards neutrality. So we're becoming less biased on those dimensions. In
Well, that's good
contrast,
news, right?
it's great news. It's great news. And it's really promising, especially because of this notion that, like, implicit bias shouldn't change. And especially because, we're seeing persistent discrimination on the dimensions of all of these social groups. And so the hope is that if our implicit biases are changing, as well as our explicit biases, then maybe someday soon, hopefully those kinds of changes in our attitudes will also trickle into changing our more structural level and individual level behaviors. So there's a hope that, there's really a promise that perhaps this justice might come soon.
Right. All those groups that you just talked about
Yeah.
are basically groups that can be, there can be a lot of prejudice towards them. They can be treated differently because of these biases. Are implicit biases driving pretty much every ism that there is out there, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
I'm thinking of ageism, racism, ableism, all these things that you're talking
Mhm.
about. Is it because of people's implicit biases, and is having a larger implicit bias always bad?
Hmm. Two questions in there.
Yeah.
Really great.
Mhm.
This feels a little bit like a recent job talk I gave where people's questions had like 18 parts and I had to keep track of them. So, no, this is much friendlier. I appreciate it. So the first question is, how do implicit biases or implicit attitudes correlate with or predict behavior?
Yeah.
And this is a super rich area of work that my friend and colleague Benedict Curdy recently published a big meta-analysis on that basically showed when we do the right kinds of studies, when we're really careful in our science, we get a correlation of about 0.4. So it's not huge, but it's also not insignificant, right? Like we have clear evidence that implicit biases at the individual level are relating to our behaviors. And what's even more surprising and compelling to me is, especially because my work is mostly situated at this level of like, how is society changing? How is history changing? There's also a huge number of new studies that are looking at the correlations between IET scores or implicit attitude scores and behaviors that are aggregated across society. So these are behaviors like the police use of lethal force against Black Americans, or birth differences, the Black-white gap in birth weight, or like school suspension differences between Black and white children. Those kinds of aggregated social behaviors. And there, once we start to aggregate behaviors and aggregate IET scores, we get correlations on the order of like 0.7, 0.8. Like these are moving into the range of large effect sizes. And so I think there's both evidence for implicit attitudes playing a role in individual behavior, like whether I choose to hire or not hire a female candidate for a science job, for instance. There's a role for implicit attitudes there. But there's also, and perhaps even more crucially, a role for implicit attitudes in predicting these like really consequential societal behaviors or societal outcomes.
Right. Absolutely.
So that's part one,
Mhm.
or answer to part one. Implicit attitudes play a role in behavior. It's obviously not the whole story. Like there's other things that go into driving our behaviors as well.
Yeah.
Part two, are there any good implicit biases, or are there any good reasons to have implicit attitudes? I think yes. And I think this shows up mostly in sort of self-confidence or like self-esteem is a measure. It can be measured through implicit attitudes or implicit measures. We can have a preference for ourself and for our own social group. And as long as it's moderate, like very, very moderate or small, but it's just a slight preference that basically shows, look, I recognize that my group is kind. I recognize that my group is good. I recognize that I'm familiar with my group. I'm able to trust my group. All of those things, that's not necessarily harmful. What's harmful is when we also have a negative antipathy towards the other group. And when we think, because my group is good, the other group must be bad. Right. And especially when that shows up at like a really, really high magnitude. So when we get, some people are scoring at the upper echelons of having implicit attitudes, and like there we don't have any evidence that that's a good thing to have. Like being implicitly strongly biased against a certain group, I just don't see that as being helpful in any way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder, going back to what we were talking about bugs off the top, like that's an implicit bias that probably has some form of evolutionary history that has been meaningfully important, right? Like, is that a fair categorization of it?
Definitely.
Yeah, so I think it's easy to see then, like, yeah, we don't like bugs because of X, Y, and Z. Z. Why did I say Z?
I don't know. We're a North American podcast.
Yeah, North America. Yeah, I'm trying to placate our American listeners. But there could be reasons for it that are sort of evolutionarily rooted. That could be important. No, I think thanks for sharing that, because I think that's a really good insight that I wouldn't have necessarily made on my own. So thanks.
Mm-hmm. And to continue with the onslaught of questions, Tessa,
yes.
what are there people that are more likely to carry implicit biases? Like, are there defining factors in an individual where you can be like, okay, because they're high in this, or this, I would expect they'd be more biased towards certain groups?
There are some demographic differences. So what I mean by that is like there are political differences in sort of the magnitude of bias that we see against certain groups. But those aren't always consistent. So for instance, we find that in American data, political conservatives are much more biased are much more pro-straight, anti-gay than political liberals, for instance, on implicit and explicit measures. Whereas there's not nearly as much of a political difference about age. So political liberals and political conservatives are pretty closely matched in terms of how much they prefer young versus older people. So it's not, there are, like, for any individual topic, there are some demographic differences, but it's not always there. But I think, again, pointing to this idea of like situations and implicit biases as being embedded in our context or embedded in our culture, embedded in our situations, there are some features of situations that predict more implicit bias. And there was a really shocking paper that came out last year from Keith Payne, who's a professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, that I think the paper was titled something like the legacy of, or the historical roots of implicit bias. And what they did is they looked at maps of the historical rates of slavery in the United States. So they found basically the counties that had the highest number of previously enslaved peoples in the 1800s. And then they took their map of IAT scores across those same counties in 2018. And what they found is that those historical roots of slavery predicted the current rates of IAT scores. And so what that's telling us is like there's some sort of manifestation of places that were, previously had histories of slavery, which now have, Confederate monuments, and they now have greater residential segregation and all of these other sort of structural features that have persisted since the 1800s. Those are the kinds of situations that will give rise to higher anti-Black, pro-white bias.
Right. Wow.
I know, such a cool paper.
That's a really, really cool paper. I'm kind of interested in, you talked about sexual orientation as an example, and I think that's a really beautiful example to go into for my next question is, when you're talking about implicit biases and talking about, maybe generational, like implicit bias where it's handed down through your family members and your experiences, when it comes to exposure of other groups, different individuals, is that what kind of can lead to changes, or does that necessarily like cause change? I think of an example for take a conservative family in America or North America that generally have anti-gay views or opinions or biases, and then one of their children is a part of the LGBTQIA2S plus community, and they already have established a good bond with them. Would they be more likely to change their implicit biases, or is that less like, are they like just more likely to have strife because of that?
Such a great question. I love that you asked that. Yes. So the short answer is the first point that you mentioned, which is they're more likely to change. So we know that sexual orientation is really unique, especially in the set of attitudes that we're looking at, because it's the only one that has a concealable identity. And what I mean by that is like you can meet someone and not know their sexual orientation until you've already formed a positive relationship. You've already formed a friendship, whether they like bugs or not, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas that's not the case for something like weight or age or race, right? That's written on our bodies. So with sexual orientation, what's so cool about that is we think that unique feature of concealability has been really important in shifting individual people's minds. And we have like a whole bunch of anecdotal examples of this, of people like the Senator Rob Portman in the United States, who was a senator who actively voted and like made lobbies and laws against gay rights. And then his own son came out as gay, and he came out and reversed all of those decisions. Like he changed not only his attitudes, but he changed his behaviors as well. Mm-hmm. And that we see is more often the case when people have formed these positive relationships with friendships. So I think that is definitely one of the reasons why sexual orientation is changing faster than any of the other, or attitudes about sexual orientation are changing faster than any of the others that we're looking at. Another reason, though, is that formation of friendships and positive experiences and exposures is accumulating over time alongside a lot of focus of, same-gender marriage legislation, gay rights, pride marches, all of these things. That societal prioritization alongside the individual experiences of positive relationships, I think together form this kind of snowballing effect of change that we're seeing in sexuality attitudes.
Yeah, that's amazing. I really like the idea of this kind of concealed identity, because I can see that playing a role in a lot of other areas, specifically, racism. Gender orientation is also a unique one.
Yeah.
because of, the ambiguity of that and, different transitional stages for individuals that maybe identify as transgender. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of, variability within that. Whereas as you said, the concealed identity with sexual orientation, you can have individuals that are implicitly biased for their whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
And, create these really close bonds with individuals and never breach the conversation of sexual orientation because it wasn't necessary.
Yeah,
And then it becomes knowledge, and they're like, well, I can't hate all of these people because
exactly.
I love this person, or I'm close to this person now.
Yeah. And
It
then our
really,
old
really unique.
friend, yeah, exactly. Our old friend cognitive dissonance kicks in, and it's like, how
Yes.
am I going to love this person and also hate that group? And either you just sit in that discomfort, but we know that people really don't like to sit in discomfort. So you usually resolve it, and usually in the favor of preferring that group, like changing your attitude about the group rather than changing your attitude about a person.
Maybe it starts with, an exception for, you're the
Yeah,
exception to the rule. And then it slowly just kind of eventually dissipates. Right.
that's right. Exactly.
Really cool.
Yeah.
So these positive experiences can have significant change.
Mm.
Does negative experiences with other groups increase implicit bias?
Presumably, this is
Yeah.
yeah, I would assume so. I mean, we have some experimental evidence of that. That it's it's not quite as compelling, but basically, if we tell you about a certain person, let's call him Bob. I think in the studies his name is actually Bob, and we tell you that he ran into a house and he destroyed the house, and he was stomping on a whole bunch of he broke in through the windows and he was stomping on a whole bunch of your favorite toys, and he went up to your bedroom and he stole precious items from your bedroom and all those things. We can see that kind of negative narrative about a certain person creates this really negative implicit bias against Bob. Like, you really don't like him explicitly and implicitly.
He's a bit of an asshole. Yeah.
He's a bit of an asshole. What's really interesting, though, is that so this is work by my friend and colleague Tom Mann, and what's really interesting from his work is that we can change those initial impressions by telling you one thing, which is by just telling you that Bob was the reason why Bob broke into that house, was smashing your toys, went up and stole precious items from the bedroom, was because your house was on fire. And he was running through and trying to stomp out the fire. He ran up to your bedroom, your kids were in the bedroom, and he took your kids, your precious items, out of the bedroom and brought them to safety. And what's really cool is we can see a flip in your implicit and explicit attitudes by having you reinterpret the narrative that you heard early on. And it's similar in the sense of like your early negative experience with someone can, with sort of this new revealing positive information, also be flipped for the better.
Right on.
Wow.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that it shows sort of the malleable aspect of it, right?
Yeah,
Like it can
exactly.
change. Yeah. So I think this is a perfect point to go back because you really intrigued me when you said that there's a way that we can go back and measure these biases over time. And
Yeah.
you alluded to this idea that we can go back and see what the Victorian individual is thinking. So,
Yeah.
so knowing that we can change over time and that
Mhm.
context is important, how do you go about studying that over human lifespans, plural?
Yeah, definitely. So what's been really cool is the intersections of the fields between psychological science and computer science. And at that intersection has emerged this field of sort of using natural language processing, which are like really fancy machine learning and computer science techniques applied to texts, like books and newspapers and all those things, to study social attitudes and to study social stereotypes. So again, another paper that I just totally nerd out about was a paper by Eileen Caliscan that was published in Science maybe in 2016, I think. And what she showed is that we can use these natural language processing methods and basically look at texts of like 800 billion words and look at the geometry of words in those texts. So we basically look at, are the words like woman and science closer together in space than the words like women and arts, for instance, or is probably the reverse true, right? Woman is probably closer to art than woman is closer to science. Mm-hmm. And we can also do things like look at how close is Black American to bad versus good, or white American to bad versus good, and so on and so forth. And by doing that, we can basically extract out from this language the social associations that are going on, the social representations that are going on in our language. And she showed that we can use that method and directly replicate the results that we had on the IAT. So she found that, we have these results that, older people are associated with bad and younger people are associated with good, and all of the other biases that we've talked about. those are also present in our 800 billion words of natural language from today. So that alone is like super exciting and super shocking, because it just
Yeah,
opens up like this whole, like the best kind of can of worms that you could ever imagine, of
totally.
just
Yeah.
all the different things that you can do with that. And so in our first study, we obviously got super excited about this. We talked to Eileen. We were like, okay, what can we do that would be compelling for computer scientists, but more importantly for psychologists,
Mhm.
And one of the things that came out was, well, there are all of these ideas in psychology about how gender stereotypes, that's our sort of first case study that I'll talk about, how stereotypes, and specifically gender stereotypes, are pervasive in our culture. And so we kind of intuitively think, okay, the stereotype that women are associated with the home and men are associated with work, that seems pretty widespread across, everything that we think about. But until this new method that Eileen introduced, we didn't have a good way of quantifying and testing exactly how pervasive they were across all of these different facets of our culture. So was it true that in children's books, there was no association of women with home and men with work? Was it true that in children's TV shows? Was that also true in adult TV shows? Was that also true in adult books? And so on and so forth. So what we wanted to basically do is use this method to quantify for the first time the actually collective and pervasive nature of something like gender stereotypes. And so we did that. We used 65 million words across 7 unique child and adult corpora of texts. And we used this natural language processing method. And we found that it was all of these different stereotypes that we were looking at, all these different gender stereotypes were shockingly consistent across these different corpora. So even in children's speech, we found a corpus of children basically speaking naturally to their parents or their caregivers. Even in those early years of speaking to their parents, children were expressing gender stereotypes that women are in the home and men are at work, or women are good at reading and men are good at math, or women are good at arts and men are good at science, and so on. All these stereotypes were present in these early corpora. And so that, that alone was just so exciting and so shocking to sort of quantify that collective nature of our social attitudes.
Yeah, certainly. First of all, thank you for explaining that in a way that made so much sense to me,
Okay.
because I was looking at the title of the paper that
Yeah.
was just recently published, and I was like, I know what each of those words individually mean,
But
but
all together.
I couldn't tell you what they meant altogether. And you put it all together. The package has sort of coalesced for me. So thank
Perfect.
you. That's great.
Good.
Um, so knowing that we can go back now and
Yeah.
we can sort of start looking and at these texts. Um,
Mm-hmm.
where do we go next? Like what is the for you? What is the question that you're really dying to get to answer here?
Yeah. So knowing that we can go back, we can now start to look at the attitudes and stereotypes and representations of cultures that we've never tested before, right? We can look at the Victorian era and see what were the attitudes and stereotypes that they held. And we can actually start to discover some of the things that we might not have known. Because we're using a quantitative sort of natural language method, these are able to uncover sort of the underlying structure in our language, the underlying biases that might be communicated through these texts. So we can do sort of a discovery, and sort of like an anthropologist discovery of previous social attitudes and stereotypes. So that's really cool. But even more exciting, if there is a more exciting thing than that, is we can trace how those representations from the Victorian era, for instance, have actually transformed over the span of these 200, 300 years at a sort of granular level, right? We can see whether there's a spike in these gender stereotypes that occurs following the women's movement, or a quick drop following a certain kind of social protest that happened, in 1910 or something like that. So we can start to see this really exciting granular interweaving between our social attitudes and our stereotypes measured in these really hidden ways through our language and big societal events. And so
Yeah.
to me, this like super exciting potential is seeing that interweaving of our individual minds, our individual stereotypes, and our broader culture.
Yeah, definitely. I can entirely appreciate that. It would be really fascinating to be able to see, are these moments in time,
Mm-hmm.
having these drastic changes on the way that we are implicitly biased. And I think back to like this summer with the Black Lives Matter movement,
Exactly.
and could we see, or would you see a change following that? And I think that would be fascinating to really dive into. I have two questions though. One of
Yes.
them is, could you use this sort of approach to modern communication techniques? Like, I think about Twitter being the cesspool that it is.
Mm.
Could you go back and farm the language that's being used out of Twitter and be able to measure it in the same way that you would from these other texts that you've been using?
Yes. is
Ah.
the excited answer. Yes. Twitter might be a little bit hard just because there are paywalls in the way. But one thing that we just hired an amazing recent computer science grad. His name's Yoav Rabinovich, and he and I are working on building this corpus of Reddit data from 2007 through to present day. And we're doing it by month. So we're able to, what's really exciting about that too is I feel like the most common sentence I've said during this podcast is really exciting, but truly
It is
exciting.
really exciting. So yeah, well justified.
Fair. So what we're able to do, because we have this more contemporary data, is we can look at how the language data that we have over time from Reddit matches up with the IAT data that we have over the same time span. And what's wonderful about that is it provides a sort of validation of, are we actually, if these two things match up, if the language biases seen in Reddit match up with the IAT biases seen from actual people sitting down at the computers, then we have more valid evidence and more valid reason to say, okay, great, now we can use this method to trace back in time and look at Victorian era attitudes. So yes, short answer, again, we can. Reddit data will be the one coming out first, and
who knows where from?
tuned. Who knows exactly?
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think it's interesting to be able to apply these techniques, and obviously there's this huge compendium of
Exactly.
language out there, so why not go at it? The other question that's sort of percolating in the back of my mind is related to languages that themselves are gendered, and I think about French being the obvious example here. How do you check for gender biases in a language like that, where the words themselves are already sometimes at least charged with gender?
Yeah, you basically do the same thing, the same method, but it does seem to matter whether or not a language is gendered in terms of the strength of gender stereotypes. So again, another paper that was really inspiring by Molly Lewis, that was just out, I think, end of last year in PNAS. They looked at the gender biases using this natural language processing technique. They used the strength of gender bias in 25 different languages. And then they also wanted to see, are those languages that have gendered encoded in the nouns or in the adjectives or something like that, are those more biased than the non-gendered language? And they found that indeed they were. It wasn't a super big effect size, so it doesn't seem to be everything that's going on. There's also cultural stereotypes on top of that sort of structural nature of the language, but it does certainly seem to maybe draw attention to gender in a different way that creates slightly stronger biases, perhaps.
Really interesting. This is really cool. I'm curious because you're talking about going back and seeing the differences in these implicit biases as we go through our history. Are we just sort of on like the roller coaster that is like implicit bias, and we have no control over where we're going, or is there something that's like tangibly shifting within the individuals or societies that's making this implicit bias, these implicit biases change?
Wow, what a cool question. It's so funny because I think I've often thought about this roller coaster of implicit bias that we're on as sort of the societal change. We're just sort of like attached to society in some way, and so we're following what's happening in society. But obviously, like, there is a conductor of the roller coaster, to extend that analogy maybe a bit too far. And I think like we can scream really loud and stop the roller coaster and like tell them to stop and all those things. So I think that even as individuals riding a societal roller coaster, riding these shifts of, legislation and social movements and things that seem to emerge out of nowhere, even we as individuals have a role and a responsibility to influence those kinds of societal events. So I think like we've seen the impact of individuals in creating change historically. And I think we can continue to see that in contemporary times as well.
Absolutely. I like that sentiment a lot. One more question before, I say that and we always continue with more questions. So I'm not going to say one more
There's
question.
so many good questions.
Okay. Yeah. No, this is great.
Yeah. That being said, I'm interested in, it's a topic that's really interesting and relevant right now. And has been for a while. When it comes to implicit biases and stereotypes, and just prejudice in general, how do you approach improving systematic issues, and like what are the approaches that are most impactful? I guess I think of affirmative action as an example. What are the benefits to helping or changing people's implicit biases, can you do it overnight? Can you do it through like a program, change people's biases, Can we transition that way? Or is it more of like you need to make changes individually, and then eventually society, with all these individuals changing their biases, will gather around that and have the same same biases?
Yeah. I think it's probably the fastest change that we may be able to see, and the most durable change perhaps even, is that we change the situations first, so that we do things like we have certain prescient leaders or something who change legislation, perhaps even before individuals have changed. We use things like affirmative action that, maybe not everyone's on board with, but they change the nature of the representation in our institutions, in our schools, in our, businesses, all of those things. And with those structural changes, with changes in the world that we can see around us, then individuals kind of catch on. So it's maybe less that like each individual needs to go home and do their homework and do an implicit bias training program and all of these things, and then like eventually they'll come to the realization that they need to change laws. I think it's really like we just need to have a few people who are woke enough to make changes in our society, and then the rest of us to follow them.
Right.
We need to move towards having situations that are less biased.
Yeah.
To create individuals that are less biased.
It seems like we're kind of going back to that idea of, your exposure and the positive experiences that you're having, right? If you're having people that are, less privileged and in minority groups that may have biases against them in the greater population, if we have positive examples and positive experiences with leaders in those positions, then things might change. Yeah. Just like, having a parent that is anti-gay, having a gay child might change their opinion and their biases.
That's right. Yeah. It really does come full circle of our talk today, of really thinking like, if exposure is where our biases are coming from, then exposure to a different world will be the way that we can change our biases as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And with the last 4 years, I know it's an interesting day to kind of reflect on this, considering it's inauguration day. I feel like over the last 4 years, it felt like maybe these implicit biases, at least in America, became more explicit, if that makes sense, at least from a Canadian standpoint. I know you experience things very differently than us as bystanders here, but it seems like there was a lot more explicit stereotyping and biases that were in the forefront, at least with a leader that was essentially like allowing it to, endorsing that explicit bias, right?
Yeah, it's a really important and interesting question, and one that I've been grappling with for the past 4 years, and also particularly so for the past few weeks, because, and you're some of the first people to know this, we finally have, so in our original paper that I talked about at the beginning of sort of tracing implicit biases from the early 2000s all the way through to now, we actually stopped in 2016, and we just provided forecasts, and we said, based on the trends that have happened in the past, these are the trends that should continue from 2016 through to 2020. Of course, this was done before we knew that the shit was going to hit the fan, like this was all done before then. Okay. And what's particularly exciting is we ended 2020, as everyone knows, finally, and we finally have that data to test. And so I've just finished cleaning and preparing it, and what was so shocking to me is that we followed the trends that we set for the past 10 years. The past 4 years have continued to move towards neutrality. So with some exceptions, we have age biases seem to be showing something slightly different, but really at the broadest level, the forecasts were accurate. Like we were shockingly close. And so how can that be? How can we have something that continues to show that our explicit biases are decreasing, our implicit biases have continued to decrease, even in the midst of a Trump, even in the midst of all of this endorsement of go out and be prejudiced in society. Despite that, we seem to be showing continued change. I think the only way to think about how we might reconcile those two things is perhaps our perceptions of things just getting so much worse over the past 4 years are a little bit distorted. Just like we, have a distorted perception of politics, and we only pay attention to those people who are really like extreme in their political orientation, and we don't really recognize that the vast majority of people have more moderate views on politics. We might also just be seeing those cases where like they are extreme and horrific events that are occurring in society. And yet despite that, perhaps the majority of society, perhaps even because of that, those extreme events that are kind of becoming outliers in a sense, are pushing the rest of us to say, we need to bond together as the majority of society and actually continue to do the difficult work to change our society for the better, even in the face of these really horrific events.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
could be, they could be reconciled. I think I need to keep thinking about it.
Mhm.
But I don't think it's as simple a story as everything has legitimately got worse everywhere for everyone. I think it might be a little bit more perhaps hopeful and also informative to think about the nuance between what we're seeing and what we're, as a society and as individuals.
Yeah, I
Sure.
think
Yeah.
with the internet and with globalization and
Yeah.
the news cycle and the way that things are presented to us through the media, I think it's easy to get to think that way, and that's that's probably what a lot of people are feeling, that kind of fatigue. But also, it's a great point. I think seeing this change and seeing how bad things can be, at least it's in the open now,
Yeah.
where it was ignored or previously brushed aside. And
Yeah.
I think that could be, as you so eloquently put, like I think that could be a really positive thing in the end. And you can see, and it's awesome that we're seeing in your work
Mhm.
these actual changes. The implicit biases aren't getting worse. They're actually becoming more neutral. This is actually really good. And I think that looking at the news is not a good representation, or these
Right.
extremist groups. Looking at those, it won't help us at all.
Right. It only just continues the doom scrolling and continues the despair.
Absolutely, which we have become very accustomed to these days, it seems.
Yeah.
Tessa, just before we kind of wrap up here, because I know it's
Yeah.
getting late and you've got more editing to do, and I'm sure more importantly,
Please help
celebrating
me
to do.
procrastinate. Yeah.
Celebrating certainly then.
Sure.
Obviously we're appreciative of everything that you've shared with us today. I've found this episode to be incredibly enlightening. How might somebody get in touch with you if they want to learn more about your work or even just kind of follow along with the amazing research that you're doing?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I should also say this has been such a blast. It's been really, really fun to talk to you both. If you want to get in touch, you can go to my website. It's Tessa ES, which is my middle initials, Charlesworth, .wordpress.com. And then you can also follow me on Twitter. I'm trying to remember my Twitter handle because I never tweet at myself. I think it's at TES Charlesworth.
The good news, we'll have it all on your bio page on our website. So
for your help, Tessa, it's
perfect.
at Tess Charlesworth.
Oh, I was right. Okay, great. Some sort of implicit knowledge came in there. So those would be the two best ways to sort of follow the work. Send me an email, but yeah, definitely get in touch if you're interested. I'm always happy to nerd out about psychology or answer questions about implicit bias.
What an awesome conversation to have on Inauguration Day and during these times. It's really inspiring to hear.
Yeah, no, it was, as I said, it's been such a blast. And yeah, thank you for the work that you're doing to bring science to the public. I love it.
Our absolute pleasure. Anybody who's listening along, they can follow BrainBuzz on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to our newsletter at brainbuzzpod.com. And join us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at BrainBuzzPod. Until next time, cheers.
Cheers.